Story 1. I work as security dispatch at a tribal casino, handling the phones, radio communications, and occasionally monitoring some of the surveillance cameras. Most nights are uneventful, just routine checks and the occasional drunken guest causing trouble. But every now and then, something strange happens. One night my supervisor and I were chatting in my office. One of the surveillance monitors was focused on a hallway in the hotel section. As we talked, we both noticed the lights on the screen flickering slightly. At first, we didn't think much of it, maybe a faulty bulb or a power surge. But then, as we kept watching, something odd happened. From the far end of the hallway, we saw what can only be described as a vaguely humanoid, but almost invisible shape moving toward the camera. It wasn't solid. It looked more like a shimmer or a distortion, like heat waves rising off asphalt. It moved steadily down the hall, passing directly under the camera before disappearing off screen. My supervisor and I just stared at each other, our conversation forgotten. "Did you see that?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," he replied, his voice quiet. We both turned back to the monitor, half expecting something else to happen, but the hallway was still again. I rewound the footage to make sure we hadn't imagined it. Sure enough, the figure was there, clear as day, moving in that strange, shimmering way. We debated calling someone from the surveillance team, but what could we even say? "Hey, we think a heatwave ghost walked down the hall?" We ultimately kept it to ourselves, agreeing it was probably nothing but weird lighting or a camera glitch. Still, I felt a chill every time I passed that hallway on future rounds. Nothing ever came of it, but it gave us a story to share whenever people brought up the idea of the casino being haunted. The strangest experiences, though, came later, during the pandemic shutdown in early 2020. For the first time in years, the casino closed its doors for a few months. As part of the security team, I still had to be there to guard the property. It was eerie, to say the least. The usual chaos of slot machine noises, crowds, and overhead music was replaced by silence. The emptiness of the building made every sound seem louder. Footsteps echoed through the halls and the hum of the air conditioning felt oppressive. The hotel was especially creepy. There were only about 5 of us on the entire property at any given time, and I always knew exactly where everyone was. So when I saw a hotel room light turn on through an exterior camera, I knew no one should have been in that room. Curious and slightly unnerved, I called for a couple of officers to check it out. They took the master key and headed up to the room. When they got there, they found one of the bedside lamps turned on, even though the room was supposed to be empty. But that wasn't the strangest part. The entire room was in disarray. Pillows were scattered across the floor like they'd been thrown. The toilet paper roll had been unraveled completely, piling up in a heap on the bathroom floor. The bedspread was half pulled off the mattress, and the room felt off. The officers made a note of everything, turned off the lamp, and locked the door behind them. We didn't know what to make of it, but we chalked it up to some sort of prank or someone sneaking in before the lockdown. But then it happened again, and again. Over the next few weeks, lights in different hotel rooms would turn on seemingly at random. Each time we'd send officers to check, and each time the room would be a mess. Pillows on the floor, furniture slightly out of place, and other minor disturbances. No one was ever inside. We made a routine of verifying that all the lights were off at the start of every shift. But no matter how thorough we were, a room would inevitably light up sometime during the night. We never caught anyone on camera entering or leaving the rooms, and there were no signs of forced entry. One of my coworkers started joking that the ghosts were restless without guests to entertain. Another suggested that it was just some kind of electrical issue, though that didn't explain the disheveled rooms. By the time the casino reopened, the activity stopped. The lights stayed off, the rooms stayed in order, and life went back to normal. But those quiet months during the shutdown left me with stories to tell around. Story 2. A few years ago, I worked as a harbor master in a small marina on the coast. It was a quiet job most of the time, filled with routine tasks like monitoring the docks, coordinating with sailors, and making sure everything ran smoothly. But every now and then, something strange would happen, something that stuck with me. One morning, I was informed that a boat had been left abandoned at the marina. It wasn't unusual for someone to forget to inform us about a temporary absence, but after 2 days with no sign of the owner, I had to investigate further. The boat wasn't registered with our marina, and none of the staff recognized it. It had simply appeared in the night, tied neatly to one of the slips. I decided to check the security cameras to see when it had arrived and if I could identify the owner. The cameras were positioned to cover most of the marina, though the lighting wasn't great at night. Still, they were usually good enough to track movements on the docks. I rolled back the footage to the night the boat arrived. Around 11:30 p.m., the small sailboat appeared, gliding silently into the marina. The man at the helm was a solitary figure, his face obscured by shadows in the brim of a hat. He docked the boat with precise movements, tying it off as though he'd done it 1,000 times before. He didn't look rushed or panicked, just methodical. Once the boat was secure, the man climbed aboard and disappeared into the cabin. I fast-forwarded the footage, expecting him to return at some point to disembark or gather his things. But instead, a couple of hours later, he emerged from the cabin and stood at the stern of the boat, facing the water. And then he just stood there. For 2 hours, he barely moved. The only signs of life were the occasional tilt of his head or shift in his stance. It was unsettling to watch, like he was lost in thought or waiting for something. The stillness of the scene, combined with the gentle rocking of the boat and the faint ripples of the water, gave it an eerie, dreamlike quality. At one point during those 2 hours, a seagull landed on the boat, just a few feet away from where he stood. It seemed completely unfazed by his presence, hopping closer to him as if it expected food. He didn't react at all. No movement, no acknowledgement of the bird. The gull eventually fluttered away, leaving him alone with whatever thoughts were holding him captive. I kept rewinding and rewatching those moments, trying to find some kind of explanation. His posture never changed, rigid, almost statuesque. What could he have been thinking? Was he in some kind of trance? The whole scene felt surreal, like it was plucked from a ghost story instead of real life. At 1:30 a.m., the man did something I still can't explain. Without any hesitation or sign of struggle, he stepped off the back of the boat and into the water. It wasn't a stumble or an accidental fall. It was deliberate, as if he'd made up his mind and simply walked off. The ripples spread outward as his body sank beneath the surface. I waited, expecting him to resurface. Maybe he was taking a late-night swim or checking something below the boat. But seconds turned into minutes, and there was no sign of him. He never came back up. I rewound the footage, hoping I'd missed something. Maybe he had climbed out of the water on the far side of the boat, out of view of the camera. But no matter how many times I watched it, the result was the same. He vanished into the water and didn't return. The next morning, I reported the incident to the authorities. A search was conducted, but no body was ever found. Divers scoured the marina and the surrounding waters, but it was as if the man had disappeared into thin air. The boat itself offered no clues. Inside, everything was in perfect order. A tidy cabin, supplies neatly stored, and a small logbook that ended abruptly the day before he arrived at the marina. There was nothing to suggest foul play or any reason for him to vanish like that. The boat stayed in the marina for a month before the authorities finally removed it. No next of kin came forward, and no one ever claimed it. Story 3. I had a job once reviewing hidden camera footage for a pasta factory. My task? To figure out who was sabotaging the product. It wasn't the kind of job I'd ever imagined myself doing, but it paid well, and I didn't mind the hours. The whole situation was unnerving from the start. This factory wasn't just dealing with routine issues like small machine failures or packaging defects. They were finding things in the pasta, things that shouldn't have been there. Glass, screws, staples, and even random pieces of metal. Thankfully, none of the contaminated product ever made it to the public. The factory had metal detectors at the end of the line, a safeguard against stray machine shavings or other debris. But this wasn't just stray debris. The alarms were going off too often, and every time they inspected the affected batches, they found things that couldn't have ended up in the pasta accidentally. It was deliberate. That realization stuck with me. Imagine boiling pasta at home, not noticing a nail or a shard of glass in the pot. You feed it to your family and someone bites down. The thought alone made my skin crawl. The factory's fail-safes had saved countless people from that potential nightmare, but they needed to figure out who was behind it before something slipped through. So they installed hidden cameras near the affected production lines and hired me to review the footage. My job was to watch hours upon hours of tapes, looking for anything suspicious. At first, the tapes were dull. Endless footage of machines whirring, people moving back and forth, and forklifts beeping in the background. I sped through most of it, scanning for alarms or anyone behaving oddly. But then I started noticing things, moments that stood out. Some of it was funny, like workers sneaking snacks off the line when they thought no one was watching. Some of it was cruel, like employees mocking a newer worker who was struggling to keep up. And some of it was just plain wrong, like people bypassing safety protocols to save time. Eventually, though, I found what I was looking for: the saboteur. It was a man who worked the night shift. He'd wait until the cameras panned away, then quickly toss something into the batch. He was clever about it, always choosing moments when his movements seemed natural, like he was adjusting the machine or inspecting the product. If I hadn't been watching closely, I might have missed it. But that wasn't the creepiest thing I saw. The creepiest thing was the man on the forklift. He caught my eye because he wasn't alone. Sitting on the forklift with him, clinging to the side, was a little boy. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was hanging off the side of the machine, waving at people as his father drove through the plant. I stopped the tape and rewound it, thinking I'd miss him. But no, there he was, clear as day. The man drove around the factory floor with the child perched on the side of the forklift, completely ignoring how dangerous it was. Forklifts are no joke, heavy, fast-moving, and hard to stop. They're dangerous enough on their own, let alone with a child riding on one. It gave me an uneasy feeling, but I logged it as unusual behavior and moved on to the next tape. A week later, I found out that the same man had killed his child in a forklift accident. I didn't get all the details, just whispers from the factory staff. Apparently, the kid had been with him on the forklift again, and something went horribly wrong. Maybe the boy slipped. Maybe the man lost control. All I knew was that the accident was fatal. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't stop thinking about the footage I'd seen. That little boy, so full of life, waving and smiling as his father drove around the plant. It was like I'd been watching a ghost. And the guilt, God, the guilt. If I'd seen that tape just a week earlier, maybe I could have said something. Maybe I could have flagged it, and the factory would have disciplined the man, banned his son from the floor, and saved the kid's life. But I didn't. I wasn't hired to look for safety violations. My job was to find the saboteur, and I did. But it didn't feel like a victory. Story 4. Working as a security coordinator for a major electric company, I had access to over 80 facilities' CCTV systems. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills. Most of the time, my shifts were uneventful. You'd stare at screens for hours and occasionally catch something interesting, like a fox darting across a station or a drunk stumbling onto private property. What I saw that night, though, was something I'll never forget. It was around 3 a.m. during a long, quiet shift in late fall. I was running a maintenance check on a train station in rural Iowa. The station was one of those small, almost forgotten places tucked into the middle of nowhere. Surrounded by dense woods, it sat far from any main roads or towns. By then, my mind was half asleep, lulled by the monotony of the job and the hum of the office equipment. I panned the camera to the right, toward a set of tracks that disappeared into the trees. At first, I thought the camera was acting up. There was something at the edge of the feed, a dark, blurry shape on the tracks. I adjusted the focus, leaned forward and froze. It was a man crouched on all fours, tearing into something on the ground. His movements were sharp, animalistic, and completely wrong for the setting. It took me a moment to process what he was doing. The camera's grainy infrared image showed the glint of something wet and dark. Blood. He was eating. A deer carcass lay beneath him, its body broken and twisted, ribs exposed where chunks of flesh had been ripped away. The man worked methodically, pulling strips of meat free and shoving them into his mouth. The whole scene was lit with a pale, washed-out glow that made it look almost surreal, like some kind of nightmare caught on film. For a good few minutes, I just sat there, staring like an idiot. It was late, and my brain was running on fumes. At first, I couldn't even register what I was seeing. I'd been doing this job long enough that weird things didn't shock me easily. But this was beyond weird. It was grotesque. I completely forgot I wasn't alone in the office and could grab someone else to confirm I wasn't hallucinating. The figure didn't seem to care about the camera. He kept eating, hands slick with blood, movements mechanical and focused. The details were hard to make out. The camera was positioned at the edge of its effective range. But he looked like he was wearing heavy outerwear, something thick enough for outdoor work in cold weather. The nights had been dipping into the 30s lately, so it wasn't unusual, but the way he moved, it wasn't right. I couldn't stop staring. I kept thinking, what the hell am I looking at? I felt disconnected, like I was watching a horror movie instead of a live feed. My chest tightened with unease, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything. I just sat there, transfixed by the scene on the monitor. Eventually, I snapped out of it and remembered I wasn't alone. I bolted out of my chair and went to find the other guy on shift. He was in the break room, half asleep over a cup of coffee. "You need to see this," I told him, practically dragging him back to my station. "I don't even know how to explain it. Just look." But when we got back, the tracks were empty. The deer carcass was still there, but the figure was gone. I panned the camera frantically, scanning the woods and the tracks for any sign of him, but he'd vanished. My coworker gave me a skeptical look. "What am I supposed to be looking at?" he asked. "I swear, he was just there," I said, my voice shaky. "Hang on, I'll rewind it." I scrubbed the footage back to where I first saw the man. There he was, crouched over the carcass, covered in blood. My coworker leaned closer, his face darkening with concern. "What the hell is he doing?" "Eating," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We watched as the scene played out again. The man ripped another chunk of flesh from the deer, chewing slowly. Then, without warning, he stopped. He raised his head, pausing like he'd just realized something. Even with the poor image quality, I could see the smears of blood on his face. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, smearing the gore across his cheeks in long streaks. Then he stood up. His movements were smooth, almost unnervingly graceful. He turned toward the camera, and for a moment, it felt like he was looking right at us. The camera's infrared made his eyes glow faintly, like dull embers in the darkness. He lingered there, staring, as if he knew we were watching. Then, without a hint of urgency, he turned and walked off the tracks, disappearing into the woods. The feed was silent now, save for the faint crackle of leaves in the breeze. I replayed the footage again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My coworker said nothing, his face pale and drawn. When the figure vanished into the trees for the second time, he shook his head and muttered, "What the hell is wrong with people?" We reported the incident to our supervisor, logging it as suspicious activity. By the time anyone got out to the station to investigate, the carcass was gone. There were no footprints, no blood on the tracks, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. The footage was archived, but as far as I know, no one ever followed up on it. It was just another strange, unexplained event in a job full of late-night weirdness. Story 5, I'm a nurse, and I work nights in the ER. The hours are long, but it's usually quiet enough to catch up on paperwork or zone out with a coffee. Last night was shaping up to be the same, until Olga, the other nurse on duty, jabbed my arm with her pen. "The little girl escaped," she said, smirking. "What?" I asked, glancing up from the monitor. She pointed to the grainy security feed. There she was, Madeline, standing in the hallway just outside her room. Her figure flickered slightly on the old monitor, but it was unmistakably her. Madeline had been admitted earlier that night after a nasty fall down a flight of stairs. A tiny girl, no older than 6, with blood crusted on her face and hair. Dr. Thompson was worried about a potential subdural hematoma, so we were keeping her overnight for observation. She'd been asleep the last time I checked on her, IV securely in place. "She shouldn't be up," I muttered, leaning closer to the screen. Then I frowned. "And where'd she get those clothes?" She wasn't wearing the hospital gown anymore. Instead, she had on a black dress, white stockings, and patent leather shoes. It looked like she was dressed for church or a funeral. Stranger still, she kept whipping her head back and forth like she was expecting someone. "Well?" Olga said, not looking up from her phone. "Are you going to go get her or not?" "Yeah, I'll get her," I sighed, pushing my chair back and heading down the hallway. "Madeline?" I called softly, rounding the corner. "Madal, The hallway was empty. I frowned, walking to her room. I poked my head inside, half expecting to find her hiding. But she was right where I'd left her, fast asleep in her bed, her hospital gown wrinkled but undisturbed. The fourth line was still attached. Weird. When I got back to the nurse's station, Olga raised an eyebrow. Found her? Yeah, I said, sitting down. She's asleep, but I don't think she ever left her bed. Olga snorted. Maybe she's possessed, she teased, by that slime creature you were obsessing over last week. I shot her a glare and turned back to the monitor, chalking the whole thing up to fatigue. But something about the image of Madeline in the hallway, those clothes, the way she moved, stuck with me. At 3:40 a.m., I glanced up at the monitor again. My stomach sank. There she was, standing in the same spot, just outside her door, still wearing the dress and stockings. But this time, she looked scared, her tiny hands clutching the doorframe, her head darting toward the dark end of the hallway. Look, I said, nudging Olga. She glanced up lazily. Oh, it's our little ghost again. Cute. As she spoke, one of the overhead lights at the far end of the hallway flickered, then went out. The video feed grew darker. Go check on her, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Olga sighed dramatically but got up, muttering something under her breath. She disappeared down the hallway, her shadow stretching awkwardly under the remaining fluorescent lights. I kept my eyes on the monitor. Another light flickered, then went out, then another. The hallway was quickly plunging into darkness, leaving only the dim glow from the light above Madeline's door. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the screen. Something about the feed didn't seem right. The darkness at the far end of the hallway wasn't just shadows. It was shifting, roiling. A figure began to take shape. It was impossibly tall, thin, and distorted, like a smudge on the lens that had somehow gained form. My breath caught as it moved, slowly advancing toward Madeline. She backed away, shaking her head violently and reaching toward the doorframe as if trying to pull herself into safety. The monitor beeped. I snapped my eyes to the console. Madeline's vitals were dropping, her heart rate plunging, her oxygen levels dipping into dangerous territory. I bolted from my chair and ran down the hallway, nearly colliding with Olga. She's crashing, I shouted, shoving past her into the room. Madeline was still in bed, but her tiny body was limp. The monitor beeped frantically as her heart flatlined. I jumped into action, starting compressions and barking at Olga to get Dr. Thompson. My hands worked mechanically. The rhythm drilled into me from years of training, but my mind was racing. Blip, blip, blip. Her heartbeat sputtered back to life just as Dr. Thompson burst into the room. I sagged against the wall in relief, letting him take over. The next morning, Madeline was sitting up in bed, smiling and chatting like nothing had happened. Kids are resilient, I thought, even if the rest of us were wrecked. As I checked her vitals one last time, I asked her how she was feeling. Great, she chirped. Then she added almost offhandedly, she saved me. I froze. Who saved you? Maggie, she said brightly. I blinked. Who's Maggie? Madeline's mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding my gaze. Her father coughed and muttered something about kids in their imaginations. I didn't press further, but their reaction left me uneasy. As they packed up to leave, Madeline's father lingered. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything. Of course, I replied, trying to sound professional. Then against my better judgment, I asked, who's Maggie? Her imaginary friend. His face clouded, and he hesitated before answering. Maggie was her twin. She didn't make it. Passed away before they were born. I stared at him, my mind racing. I thought of the figure on the monitor, the way it had loomed over Madeline in the hallway, the way she'd backed away from it, toward her room, toward safety, toward someone who had been protecting her all along. Story 6. After a rough few years bouncing between jobs, I landed this gig monitoring the cameras in a corporate office building. It wasn't bad. Most nights were slow, just me, the hum of the monitors, and the occasional caffeine-fueled marathon of keeping my eyelids open. Some of the older guards complained about the monotony, but I didn't mind the quiet. It gave me time to think, though maybe that wasn't always a good thing. That night started like any other. A few cleaning staff still lingered on the lower floors. their vacuum cords snaking into view on the cameras. I was on my third cup of coffee, half watching a late-night news segment on my phone, when I noticed something odd. One of the monitors, showing the 12th floor meeting room, flickered faintly. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. The equipment here was ancient. But then I saw him. A man sat at the head of the long conference table, hunched over a laptop. It wasn't unusual for employees to work late, burning the midnight oil on some deadline. Still, there was something about the way he sat, rigid, unmoving, that drew my attention. The room was lit harshly by overhead fluorescence, casting sharp shadows around him. He wasn't typing, just staring at the screen. I kept watching for a while, noting the faint glow of the laptop and the way the fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the room. He didn't move much, just the occasional shift in his posture or a hand brushing across the keyboard. Hours passed, and I found myself checking the feed repeatedly. Midnight came and went, yet he was still there, motionless. At 1 a.m., I called one of the floor security officers. "Hey, can you check the 12th floor meeting room? There's a guy who's been working there for hours. Just want to make sure everything's okay." "On it," the officer replied, sounding half asleep. A few minutes later, he called back. "The room's locked, man. Lights are off. No one's in there." "What?" I glanced at the monitor. The man was still sitting there, his head tilted slightly to the side, his silhouette faintly backlit by the laptop. "Double check," I insisted, my voice rising. "He's right there on camera." The officer sighed but complied. I watched on the feed as he approached the room. Sure enough, the lights on the floor were dimmed, and the door remained closed. He jiggled the handle, then leaned in to peer through the small window in the door. "No one's in there," he said again. "Maybe you're seeing an old feed or something." I checked the live timestamp. The feed was current. "Fine," I muttered, more to myself than him. "I'll look into it later." I leaned back in my chair, my eyes flicking between the camera feed and the clock. The figure remained unmoving, a constant presence on the screen. Fatigue crept over me, and despite my growing unease, I eventually dozed off. A loud beep from another monitor startled me awake. My coffee had gone cold, and the small office was eerily silent. Blinking groggily, I turned my attention back to the 12th floor feed. The man was gone. The chair he had been sitting in was pushed back slightly, as though someone had just stood up. The laptop's glow was gone, and the room was dark. I rubbed my eyes and replayed the footage from the last 30 minutes. There was no sign of him leaving. One moment he was there, and the next the chair was empty. No motion, no exit. Heart pounding, I grabbed my radio. "Anyone on the 12th floor? The guy I mentioned earlier is gone, but I don't see him on any other cameras." "Nothing up here," one of the officers responded lazily. "Maybe he took the stairs." I checked the stairwell feeds. Nothing. The next morning I was still rattled. As employees began arriving for their shifts, I spotted the man from the camera near the front desk. He looked perfectly normal, clean-cut, dressed in his usual business attire, greeting his coworkers with a smile. I decided to approach him. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, "were you working late last night in the 12th floor meeting room?" He gave me a strange look. "Yeah, why?" I hesitated. I noticed you on the cameras, but when I sent someone to check, the room was locked, and you weren't there." His expression didn't change, but there was a slight pause before he answered. "Don't worry about it," he said simply, his tone clipped. Then he walked away, leaving me standing there, confused and unsettled. I told a few coworkers about what had happened, but no one believed me. "You probably fell asleep and dreamed it," one of them said with a shrug. "It's happened to me on night shifts too." It never happened again, and I stopped bringing it up after that. The man continued coming to work as if nothing had happened, and the 12th floor meeting room remained just another space in the building. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.